You are walking through life with your emotional gates left wide open. And the truth is, most people don't even realize it. A single comment can shift your entire mood. A small inconvenience can ruin your focus, and someone else's behavior can quietly take control of your inner world without your permission. If you've ever felt like your peace is fragile, like your emotions are being pulled in every direction by things you can't control, then you're not alone, because this is how most people live, reacting, absorbing, and slowly losing their sense of stability. But Stoicism teaches something deeper, something far more powerful, that your strength does not come from controlling the world around you, but from mastering what happens within you. And once you begin to see this clearly, you realize that your reactions are not automatic, they are trained, and what has been trained can be retrained. There is a quiet shift that happens when you begin to apply Stoic thinking to your life, where instead of reacting instantly, you start observing. Instead of being pulled into every emotional wave, you begin to stand steady, and instead of feeling controlled by circumstances, you begin to feel grounded in something deeper, something more stable. And this is not about becoming cold or disconnected. It is about becoming intentional, about choosing your responses rather than being ruled by them, about building a mind that is not easily disturbed. Because in the end, Stoicism is not just philosophy, it is practice, it is awareness. It is the discipline of returning to yourself again and again, especially when life tries to pull you away. If these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours. And it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. Habit 1. The discipline of the sacred pause. One of the most overlooked weaknesses in modern life is how quickly people react, because everything around you is designed to shorten your response time. Notifications demand instant replies, conversations move quickly, emotions rise fast, and before you even realize it, you are responding automatically. Not because you chose to, but because you felt like you had to. And this is where control is lost, not in the situation itself, but in the speed of your reaction to it. Stoicism teaches something that feels almost unnatural at first, which is the discipline of the pause, the ability to slow down in a moment that feels urgent, to create space where your instinct is to react, and that space, even if it is only a few seconds, changes everything, because it gives you the ability to choose your response instead of being controlled by your impulse. And Epictetus emphasized this when he taught that between what happens and how you respond, there is a space where your freedom exists, and most people never use that space because they never create it. Think about the last time someone said something that triggered you. Maybe it was disrespectful, maybe it felt unfair, and your immediate instinct was to respond, to defend, to react emotionally. But what would have happened if you had paused instead, if you had taken a breath, if you had observed your reaction before acting on it? That single moment of pause would have changed the entire outcome, not just externally, but internally, because you would have remained in control. This is not about suppressing your emotions, it is about delaying your reaction long enough to decide what to do with them. Because emotions are not the problem, impulsive reactions are. And the more you practice this pause, the more you strengthen your ability to remain steady in situations that once controlled you, and over time this becomes a habit, not something you have to force, but something that becomes natural, because you begin to value control more than immediate expression. Seneca wrote, "Anger, if not restrained, is frequently more hurtful to us than the injury that provokes it." And this becomes clear when you look at how many situations escalate simply because there was no pause, because there was no space between feeling and reacting. And when you begin to insert that space consistently, you start to notice something powerful, that the world loses its ability to control you, not because it has changed, but because you have. Habit 2. Separate your ego from reality. Most of the emotional pain you experience is not caused by events themselves, but by the meaning you attach to them, and this is where the ego quietly takes control, because the ego turns everything into something personal, something about you, something that defines you, and once that happens, your emotional response intensifies, not because the situation is objectively worse, but because your identity is now involved. Someone ignores you, and your mind tells you that you are being rejected. Something fails, and your mind tells you that you are not good enough. But Stoicism teaches you to separate facts from interpretation, because most events are neutral until you assign meaning to them. And when you begin to see this clearly, you realize how much of your suffering is self-created, not intentionally, but automatically through the stories you tell yourself. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly, reminding himself to see things as they are, not as he feared them to be. And this practice creates clarity, because instead of reacting to your interpretation, you respond to reality, and that distinction changes everything, because reality is often simpler, less dramatic, and easier to handle than the version your mind creates. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And this insight reveals something deeper, that your reactions often say more about your internal state than the external situation. And when you begin to observe this, you gain a level of awareness that allows you to respond more consciously, because you are no longer projecting your insecurities onto events. You are seeing them more clearly. So the next time something happens that triggers you, ask yourself a simple question: what actually happened, and what am I telling myself about it? Because separating those two things is where clarity begins, and clarity is what allows you to respond with reason instead of reaction. Habit 3. Protect your mental environment. There is something that most people underestimate, and that is how much their environment shapes their emotional state, not just the physical environment, but the emotional and psychological one, the people you interact with, the conversations you engage in, the energy you absorb throughout the day, because emotions are not isolated, they spread, they influence, they transfer, often without you even realizing it. If you spend time around people who are constantly complaining, constantly anxious, constantly focused on negativity, that energy begins to affect you, not because you are weak, but because you are human. And Stoicism teaches awareness in this area, not in a way that isolates you from others, but in a way that allows you to be intentional about what you allow into your mind. Epictetus emphasized the importance of guarding your impressions, because what you allow into your mind shapes your thoughts, and your thoughts shape your actions, and your actions shape your life. And when you begin to see this chain clearly, you realize that protecting your mental environment is not optional, it is essential. This does not mean cutting people off or avoiding all negativity, but it does mean becoming aware of how certain environments affect you and making choices accordingly, because if something consistently drains your energy, disrupts your focus, or affects your state, it is worth reconsidering how much access it has to you. Think of your mind as something valuable, something that needs to be protected, not in a defensive way, but in a deliberate way, because the more intentional you are about what you allow in, the more control you have over what happens inside you, and that control is what Stoicism ultimately aims to strengthen. Habit 4. Let go of expectations before they break you. One of the quiet reasons people feel constantly frustrated is not because life is particularly harsh, but because their expectations are too rigid, too specific, and too disconnected from reality. And this creates a constant tension between what they think should happen and what actually happens. And that tension is where frustration lives, because every time reality fails to match the script you created in your head, your mind interprets it as a problem, as something unfair, as something that needs to be resisted. You expect people to behave a certain way, to be consistent, to understand you, to meet your standards, and when they don't, you feel disappointed, not just because of their behavior, but because your expectation was violated. And Stoicism teaches something that feels uncomfortable at first, but becomes incredibly freeing when you apply it, which is to expect less from the external world and more from your internal response. Because the world is unpredictable, people are inconsistent, and circumstances are always changing, but your response is something you can train. Epictetus made this idea very clear when he said, "Do not seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do, and you will go on well." And what he is pointing to is not passivity, but alignment. The ability to accept reality as it is without adding unnecessary resistance to it, because resistance is what turns inconvenience into suffering. Think about how often your frustration comes from small things not going your way, a delay, a misunderstanding, a change in plans, and how quickly your mood shifts because of it. But what if you had already accepted that these things would happen? What if you walked into your day understanding that people would be imperfect, that plans would shift, that things would not always go smoothly, that awareness alone would remove the shock, and without the shock there is less emotional reaction? Marcus Aurelius practiced this daily, reminding himself each morning that he would encounter difficult people, not to lower his standards, but to prepare his mind, to remove the element of surprise, because when you are prepared for imperfection, it no longer disturbs you in the same way. And this does not make you negative, it makes you stable, because you are no longer depending on everything going right to feel okay. You are grounded regardless of what happens, and that is a form of strength that most people never develop. Habit 5. Use your emotions as fuel, not weapons. There is a common misunderstanding about emotions, especially in modern culture, where people are told either to suppress them completely or to express them without restraint. But both approaches miss something important, because emotions are not meant to be ignored or blindly followed. They are meant to be understood and directed. Stoicism does not teach you to eliminate emotion, it teaches you to use it, because every emotion carries energy, and that energy can either be destructive or constructive depending on how you handle it. And this is where most people lose control, because they either explode or shut down, without realizing that there is a third option, which is to channel. Anger, for example, can lead to impulsive reactions, arguments, and regret. But it can also be redirected into discipline, into action, into progress. And the difference lies in whether you react immediately or pause and choose how to use that energy. Seneca wrote extensively about anger, calling it a temporary madness, not because it should be avoided entirely, but because it should not be allowed to control your actions. And when you begin to see anger as energy rather than identity, you create the possibility of redirecting it. Instead of lashing out, you step back. Instead of reacting, you act with intention. You take that same intensity and put it into something productive, something that moves you forward instead of holding you back. And over time, this becomes a habit, where emotions are no longer something you fear, but something you work with. Carl Jung once said, "No tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And this reflects the idea that even the darker aspects of your emotional experience can be used for growth, not by ignoring them, but by integrating them, by understanding them, by choosing how they are expressed. And when you learn to do this, something shifts, because the world can no longer use your emotions against you, because you are no longer reacting blindly, you are directing consciously, and that changes everything. Habit 6. Stop living in a future that doesn't exist. One of the most draining habits people carry is the tendency to live in a future that has not happened yet, constantly thinking about what could go wrong, what might happen, what needs to be prepared for. And while this may feel like planning, it often turns into anxiety, because the mind begins to create scenarios that feel real even though they are not. You imagine conversations before they happen. You worry about outcomes that are uncertain. You replay possibilities as if they are inevitable, and your body responds as if all of it is real. This is what anxiety often is, not a response to what is happening, but a reaction to what might happen. And Stoicism addresses this directly by bringing your attention back to the present, because the present is the only place where your actions exist, the only place where your control exists. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself to confine his attention to the present moment, not because the future is irrelevant, but because it is not yet real. And when you anchor yourself in the present, you reduce the power of imagined scenarios because you are no longer engaging with them. Seneca reinforced this idea when he said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And if you observe your own thoughts, you will likely see how true this is, because much of what you worry about never actually happens, and yet it still affects your state, as if it did. So the next time your mind begins to spiral into future scenarios, pause and ask yourself, what is actually happening right now? Not what might happen, not what could happen, but what is real in this moment. And most of the time you will find that there is no immediate threat, nothing that requires the level of stress you are experiencing. And this realization brings you back, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, grounding way, where your attention returns to what you can control, what you can act on, and what actually matters. Habit 7. Build a fortress of internal validation. One of the most subtle but dangerous ways people lose control of themselves is by outsourcing their sense of worth to others, by allowing their confidence, their mood, and even their identity to be shaped by how they are perceived. And this often happens without awareness, because it feels natural to care about what others think, to want approval, to want recognition, to want to feel valued. But the problem is not caring, the problem is depending. Because the moment your emotional state depends on external validation, you become unstable. Because praise will lift you, but criticism will break you. And suddenly your sense of self is no longer anchored within you. It is fluctuating based on opinions, reactions, and feedback that you cannot control. And this creates a cycle where you are constantly adjusting yourself, constantly seeking approval, constantly measuring your worth through the lens of others. Stoicism challenges this at its core because it teaches that your value is not determined by how others see you, but by how you act, by your character, your discipline, your integrity. And Marcus Aurelius reminded himself of this constantly, focusing not on how he was perceived, but on whether he was living in alignment with his principles. Ask yourself a simple question at the end of your day, not "Did people approve of me?" but "Did I act with integrity?" Not "Did I impress others?" but "Did I stay true to myself?" Because when your standard becomes internal, your stability increases and your confidence becomes something that does not fluctuate with external conditions. Carl Jung captured this idea in a powerful way when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And this becomes possible only when you stop shaping yourself based on external expectations and start building yourself based on internal values. This does not mean ignoring feedback or isolating yourself from others. It means not allowing their opinions to define you, because when your validation comes from within, criticism becomes information, not destruction, and praise becomes appreciation, not dependency. And over time, this creates a kind of confidence that is quiet but strong, because it is not built on approval. It is built on consistency, on knowing who you are and acting accordingly, regardless of how others respond. Habit 8. Practice stillness and face yourself. In a world that constantly demands your attention, where every moment is filled with noise, distraction, and stimulation, one of the most powerful things you can do is to sit in silence, because silence reveals what distraction hides. And for many people, this is uncomfortable because when the noise stops, their thoughts become louder. This is why people constantly reach for their phones for entertainment, for anything that fills the space, because stillness forces you to confront your own mind, your own thoughts, your own emotions, and without practice that can feel overwhelming. But Stoicism sees this differently. It sees stillness not as something to avoid, but as something to develop. Because when you sit with your thoughts, when you observe them without distraction, you begin to understand them. You begin to see patterns, fears, insecurities, and habits that were previously hidden beneath constant activity. And this awareness is what allows you to change, because you cannot change what you do not understand. Seneca often emphasized the importance of reflection, of stepping back and examining your thoughts, your actions, your reactions, because without reflection you remain on autopilot, repeating the same patterns without questioning them. So give yourself time each day, even if it is just a few minutes, to sit in silence, to observe your mind, not to control it, not to force it, but to understand it, because the more familiar you become with your internal world, the less it controls you, and the more you control it. And something interesting begins to happen when you do this consistently. The things that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their intensity because you are no longer avoiding them, you are facing them, and in doing so, you reduce their power. Nietzsche once said, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster." And this applies here as well, because when you avoid your inner struggles, they grow in the dark. But when you bring awareness to them, when you face them with clarity, they begin to lose their hold on you. And in that process, your mind becomes a place you are comfortable being, not something you are constantly trying to escape from. Habit 9. See everything from the highest perspective. One of the reasons small problems feel so overwhelming is because your perspective narrows in the moment. Your focus zooms in, and suddenly what you are experiencing feels larger than it actually is, because you are seeing it in isolation, disconnected from the bigger picture. A comment feels like a personal attack. A delay feels like a major setback. A mistake feels like a failure. But Stoicism teaches you to zoom out, to expand your perspective, to see things not just as they are in the moment, but as they fit within the larger context of your life. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly, reminding himself of how small each moment is within the vast span of time, and how quickly everything passes. And this perspective does not diminish the importance of your experiences. It places them in context. It reduces their emotional intensity and allows you to respond more calmly. Ask yourself, will this matter in a year? Will this matter in 5 years? Will this matter at the end of my life? And most of the time, the answer is no. And that realization does not make you indifferent. It makes you selective, because you stop investing emotional energy into things that do not truly matter. You begin to reserve your focus, your attention, your energy for what is meaningful, for what aligns with your values, for what contributes to your growth, and this creates a sense of clarity, because you are no longer reacting to everything, you are choosing what deserves your response. This is what creates emotional stability, not the absence of challenges, but the ability to see them clearly, to understand their place, and to respond accordingly without being overwhelmed by their immediate intensity. And as you move forward from here, remember this quietly but clearly. Your life does not change when the world becomes easier. It changes when you become stronger, when your mind becomes steady, when your reactions become intentional, and when you stop giving your power to things that were never meant to control you, because in the end, it is not what happens that defines you. It is how you stand in the face of it. If something in this video stayed with you, if you feel even a small shift in how you see your thoughts, your emotions, or your life, then don't stop here. There's another video on your screen right now that will take you deeper into this path, so take that next step. And truly thank you for being here and for being a part of Psychresto Mind.